something I've come to realize is that a lot of service games usually don't get reviews. So I'm gonna try to change that. I'm gonna explain how I'm gonna be grading the game. I'm gonna be going category by category here. I will grade this story on a scale of 1 to 10, the art direction, the audio and the music, and the gameplay. And for games like these, also like Genshin, I'm going to be talking a little bit about support. It will matter in the final grade, and I'm gonna try to condense my thoughts into like a slogan at the end of the game, so maybe like something that I feel encapsulates the game a little bit. Let's start with the art direction, since that's probably the easiest to talk about out of all these categories. The art direction for Genshin is good. I know that's really simply put, but it's not really much to talk about here. The Genshin art direction, it's never really been too bad. It's always been generally pretty good. I think when the game was first released, most people were like, hey, this game looks pretty good. I don't really think that much has really changed with that. The enemy designs are actually, in my opinion, more interesting usually than the character designs. We've got a lot of interesting enemy designs, like the Eremite people that we fight in Sumeru. We got even the Rift towns, I think, are actually pretty interesting. There's a lot of interesting enemy designs around the overworld. But I'm gonna be completely honest, I actually think that's probably Genshin's biggest weakness, that character design is maybe not as good as enemy design, at least in my personal opinion. This isn't really anything I'm going to dock points for, but I think that the enemy designs, I mentioned the Eremites, I think the Eremites have more interesting designs than a lot of the characters that came out in Sumeru. But aside from like Sino, I expected more characters who looked like the Eremites to actually be playable, but Sino, Candace, and Dea are really the only ones that we're actually getting, who were, at least to our knowledge, that are going to be looking like that. Post-production Snowbeer, I just wanted to clarify. What I'm saying here is I just wanted more characters who share my skin tone. That's really it. I also want to say that regardless of that, I do think that there are a lot of good character designs. I think characters like Raiden, even Nahida, like a lot of the character designs are actually perfectly fine and are likable. I mean, I think a lot of people, when they first started playing the game, there was a ton of people who were re-rolling over and over again just for Diluc or catching. So I think that for the most part, the art direction for Genshin's really good. I especially actually really like the environments in Genshin. I think that like Genshin's environments have always been really strong. I think that there's a reason why every trailer about Genshin upon release for new regions always just focuses on, wow, look how pretty this looks. It's because the game does look pretty. Mondstadt looked very good. I mean, it got compared a lot to Breath of the Wild, but that's a compliment more than anything else. Liyue looks really good. Inazuma looked really good. I think that Sumeru looks really good. I think that the Chasm, it maybe isn't the prettiest thing, but it looks good. And the one I want to mention the most is actually Enkanomiya. Enkanomiya, I think, is probably one of the... It's something that kind of tells me that like Genshin's art direction is actually very good, because for me at least, it feels like Genshin at least can add variety to how the kind of environment that they're making. I was a little worried that Genshin was just going to make grassy plains in different colors over and over again when it came to like their new regions, but Enkanomiya always gave me the first sign that, hey, the team actually can go in a lot of different directions with their art, and I think that it's genuinely just really pretty, the region. This might sound odd, it kind of reminds me of like the world that never was in Kingdom Hearts, because both of them have like some sort of like odd, like almost like empty feeling where it might not feel like it's right for it to be this empty. Regardless, I think that the art direction is good. I'd give it Genshin's art direction about a 9. I do think that sometimes Genshin does falter a little bit in terms of some things with character design. I do think that the rest of the art design for the game is genuinely pretty outstanding. In terms of audio and music, it's good. There's really no complaints again, like at all. The sound effects are good for characters and enemies and impact sound effects. I think they're all really good. An example of a really good sound effect, I think that's like really satisfying to hear, at least for me, is Nahida's normal attack sound effects. There's a lot of characters that have really good sound effects. I'm not gonna go through all of them, but yeah, a lot of characters have good sound effects. The music is also generally really good. I really don't think Hoyo versus Mihoyo, whatever you want to call them, has ever really done badly with their music. Again, I think Enkanomiya is a good example of like pretty exceptional music. I really liked how the battle music sounded for this region. Really, no complaints. I think I'm gonna actually give it a 10 out of 10 here. So, the gameplay. I might have started with 2 easy categories, but this is when it starts to get a little more difficult. Genshin's lack of endgame to me is going to be almost like forever disappointing because that's directly tied to the gameplay. Genshin's gameplay, in my opinion, is actually pretty good. It's genuinely like a step above other gacha games. I play a lot of gacha games personally, and I never really consider them better than other games. Someone asked me, is God of War or Celeste better than Genshin? I'm going to always tell them, yes, those other 2 games are better, at least to me. But the amazing thing is that Genshin is able to be considered good, because gacha games, at least for me, I always felt like they have genuinely terrible gameplay. I really like Fate Grand Order because it is my first gacha game, but my god, it's disappointing playing these games sometimes because you wish that these companies would invest into actually making like almost like a full game, even though like sure they might be full games from someone else's perspective. For me, they always felt like, wow, this could be something bigger. That's why I look at Granblue and I'm honestly like impressed with Granblue because they went from where they are and now they're making like a whole RPG. Their fighting game is good, well, except for the online, but like the entire like source material for Granblue is going in directions that other gachas aren't. And that's why I appreciate Genshin, because I think Genshin for the most part is very unique in that aspect. It has a good gameplay, a good place. They're getting an anime from Ufotable, people behind like all the Fate movies and the Fate show. Demon Slayer also is what they're also really well known for. Genshin's gameplay is good. Is everything balanced in the game? Well, no. I think that certain elements are just straight up weaker than others. Geo really is not nearly as good as the others, and it kind of sucks, but the actual backbone of the gameplay is good, and the application of the gameplay is also good. It feels good playing the game. It feels satisfying. I think the game does a good job also with team building. At least for me, a lot of enjoyment from Genshin comes from mixing and matching a bunch of different characters to create kind of funny team comps. I literally have a party set just called Funny in my game, where I just mess around and plug in random units to see if they can work together. If I was to talk about complaints though, the lack of 4-star main DPSs is actually a pretty significant complaint. A lot of 5-star DPSs, but it feels weird that the only real good 4-star DPSs we have are like Yanfei and C6 Noelle and Ningguang. It feels unusual that we don't really have much else. You can make other characters work in main DPS roles. The lack of a dedicated main DPS besides those 3 that I named feels genuinely not good for beginners. I've tried to help friends who wanted to get into Genshin. A lot of the issues with Genshin is simply the fact that there isn't a lot of ways for beginners to feel like they're having a much impact, especially with the fact that whenever they add new characters, you can't really ascend them. Going back to the lack of endgame, though, I want to talk about patch quality a little bit here. Aside from story, I want to see an addition to the game in basically any other way besides story in their other game, Honkai Impact. There's a bunch of different things to do besides just story. Honkai isn't really an open world game for a lot of it, but they have open world sections, and while they are not nearly as impactful or as large and spanning as Genshin's world, it's still available to play and is a bit of a difference from the actual base gameplay for Honkai. Honkai also has a bunch of different competitive modes that are like the Abyss, the Memorial Arena, and when you're higher level, the Super String Dimension. They also have the Elysian Realm, which is personally what I really enjoy when I actually do play Honkai. I think the Elysian Realm is really fun. They have a lot of content for people to play in Honkai and a lot of different ways to play. In Genshin, aside from Overworld and the Spiral Abyss, there isn't anything else. And I know that's because maybe you could argue that the open world is supposed to be all the content. It feels bad that there isn't any content for someone who might feel like they want more of a challenge. They don't have any content really besides the Spiral Abyss to engage with. Maybe adding just like some challenging content here or there, like the equivalent of maybe like a Memorial Arena or the equivalent of an Elysian Realm. I think an Elysian Realm in Genshin would actually be really fun. And just to explain, the Elysian Realm in Honkai is a segment where you get to choose a character out of the characters that you own, and you basically run through like almost like a little mini dungeon where at the end of each floor you get a certain buff depending on which route you chose, and whenever you get these buffs you feel yourself progressively more and more powerful. It's a little fun game within the game. I think that like just adding something like an Elysian Realm, like a little dungeon crawl where you take one unit and you get to just push them to the absolutely absurd levels would just be something fun, because at least for Elysian Realm, you could toggle the difficulty to whatever level you want, really. And having that ability just makes the game more fun. It allows the game to have a little bit of a challenge, or just maybe to have like a little bit of a turn your brain off moment if you put it to easy. It's fun for both casuals and non-casuals. I feel like just adding something like that to Genshin would drastically like increase people's receptiveness to the game. Post-production again. This was recorded pre-TCG. TCG is a step in the right direction. Please continue. Aside from that though, I do think that some smaller things on the side, I think co-op is very lackluster in this game, if I'm going to be honest. I think that just clearing domains and bosses, oh, that's it. It's not like good. That should not be the only co-op content. And back when I started playing Genshin, I didn't really mind that much because I always was like, hey, they'll add more. Or maybe just, hey, like, that's fine. At least it's some co-op content. Even like a game like Pokemon Violet and Scarlet is a game that I know has a lot of bugs. The co-op in that game is actually good. There's story progression with co-op partners. There's a bunch of different things to do. You could do Terra raids in Pokemon. You could do the story together. You could do anything together. The only thing you can't do together in Pokemon in the world is doing gym leader battles with each other. And that makes sense because gym leader battles are one-on-one battles to begin with. The game does come up a lot better than Genshin, and for such a buggy and incomplete game as Pokemon is, the fact that the game makes me look at Genshin's multiplayer and makes me kind of frown, that's kind of sad. I want a Genshin to actually add more co-op options for people to play, and I want them to add more endgame content for people who might want more of a challenge. With that being said though, the only other thing I really have to mention in terms of gameplay is really character quality and patch quality. I think that the characters are usually pretty fun. I really won't be criticizing something like FOMO in a game like Genshin because that's kind of how all gacha games work, and the regions are pretty fun to explore. Don't really like some mechanics, like I didn't really like Inazuma's weird Electrogana mechanic, but Sumeru's mechanics were at least a lot more enjoyable to me. Aside from that, I think really the only thing we have left to talk about is story. The story for Genshin is the most contentious part about this. There's a lot of people who really love this story, but it's time for me to be a little frank here. I think that when it comes to gacha games, the gameplay is usually the worst thing, and usually a lot of people look to gacha games for the story. Since the gameplay is bad, they need to compensate somewhere, and usually these gacha games have excellent stories. The characters have just have something about them that usually makes them a lot more lovable, and you can grow to connect to them. I think that you could look at most gacha games and you probably could realize some of that in each of them. Like, Fate Grand Order's main purpose at this point really is just a visual novel more than anything else. Honkai Impact's story is pretty damn strong. Then we look at Genshin's. Genshin is, in my opinion, the first of its name usually in this category to have middling to bad story. I don't really think that anyone's gonna argue that the lore for the game is like, no one's gonna say that the lore is bad. It's pretty interesting lore. The actual story though that's being provided is where the issue lies. In my opinion, this is where Genshin's weakest point is actually. The story fluctuates in quality. Me saying it's bad, I know I might have upset some people, but I don't actually think the story's bad. I think the story just fluctuates too much, and that's why I say it's bad. Mondstadt was the introduction for the entire game. It's honestly pretty average, which I think is generally the case for most stories. Usually the introduction for most stories, at least from my experience, is introductions are usually the most average component of a story. Unless you're like Attack on Titan, like a story like Attack on Titan tried to play a lot into its intro being as shocking as possible, which made it a good intro. There's a lot of stories that have very attention-grabbing intros, and usually they're really good, but unless you can actually achieve that in a reasonable way, I think for the most part, intros are usually just standard. It's not like they're anything too crazy. Even like Fate's introduction is pretty standard up until... If I was to rate it, it'd probably be like a 6 or 7 out of 10. I think Leeway is a general improvement from Mondstadt. Still pretty average. A lot of the story felt decent, and I liked the story beats and learning about the general workings of Leeway, but a lot of the characters felt kind of like they just did something and that was it. If that makes sense. I understand the characters might not always be the focus, but the characters felt like they didn't even need to really be there to do what they needed to do. Aside from Tartaglia, everyone else, Ningguang and everyone else felt more minor than I kind of wish they were. Regardless, it was still pretty good. I'd probably give Leeway also if I get Mondstadt at 6, I think Leeway is a 7. Going on to Dragonspine, I think that you could probably give it an 8. This is because I think Dragonspine was probably the first actual shimmer of the Dragonspine story, since it had a lot more focus on characters. It helped flesh out the story and made it more enjoyable as a story. We get to learn a lot about Albedo and a little bit about the world around us, and it's genuinely interesting lore. I don't really think there's much to complain about. I'd give it an 8. It did give me hope though, which is the problem, because the region right after that was Inazuma, who I think has the worst story out of the bunch. The story for Inazuma might not be the worst story of all time, but to go from average to decent to all of a sudden being kind of mediocre just made it feel a lot worse. Inazuma introduced so much moving parts to the story of its region. They had all of these different parts with Ayaka and her family. We had to learn about Kokomi and Watatsume Island. We had to learn about Sarah and everything relating to the Shogunate. We had to learn about all these different moving parts that are all expecting equal attention, but it kind of fails to utilize any of them very well. The resolution happens almost too quickly. Ayaka helps you, and then you get to Kokomi, you randomly become the leader of the Swordfish team, and it kind of shallow, I guess. And it feels even more shallow when we get characters like Teppei, who doesn't really feel like he has much of a purpose besides trying to make us feel like, hey, I'm sad because Teppei died. It felt not great. I think that even when they got to the story quest, that's also not the most pleasant part for Inazuma. Inazuma generally didn't have the best story quest for each character either. The Archon quest wasn't great, neither was the story quest. I didn't really like Raiden's story quest. It feels like her first part was not great, and her second was just trying to make the first one actually feel whole. Genuinely, in my opinion, the best thing to come out of Inazuma was Ito, and that's because he's funny. But that's when we get to Sumeru. Sumeru, I think, is generally the region that had me the most worried because of what happened with Inazuma, but we got lucky. It delivered. Sumeru was a story that also had a lot of moving parts. Maybe not, it didn't have nearly as much as Inazuma, but they had a lot of moving parts compared to the others. And sure, they could have used some more than they did. Candace kind of just exists, but everyone else serves a purpose and makes it feel like a genuine group. You meet all these characters like Alhaitham, Asino, Dea, all these characters, Nahida. You learn about all these characters and you become an actual group. and you actually do things, and it feels like everyone has an actual purpose to what they're doing in this scenario, which is why it feels really good. Nahida's story was interesting, and getting to see the conclusion of the story felt fulfilling. And maybe it doesn't leave me super excited or anything for Fontaine. Like, it doesn't make me look forward to it in like bated breath. I'm not like sitting here like I need it now. But it introduced elements to the story without making it feel like it was super bloated. Like Genshin actually does a lot. Genshin does a lot of random drops of large, copious amounts of lore that they just drop on our head, but it didn't really feel like that for this region. It felt like they gave us information that was actually helpful, and they didn't do it in a way that felt overwhelming. All in all, though, I think that this really is the Genshin's most defining aspect. It's inconsistent. The story can fluctuate from being average to kind of mediocre to good. This doesn't stop with the Archon quest, like I said, it does it to the story quest too. Some characters like Zhongli have, like, in my opinion, really good story quests. Stuff that made me sit down and be like, dang, this is some really good story. But then you get to, like, characters like Yai, whose story quests just felt miserable to play through for me. I felt like it was genuinely really boring and just was trying to humor me, which I don't really want the story quest to do. I don't want it to always be humorous. I want there to at least be some purpose to it besides being like, hey, laugh. Again, though, I will say a character like Ito again kind of delivers because he perfectly balanced like humor to, hey, this is actually a kind of interesting story. Story value, I think, in my opinion, is something to actually consider, because I think a character like Venti is not a character that I'm honestly that interested or invested in, but I think he had a good quest. It was competent and entertaining. It helped actually in me not feeling super bad about, like, it made me feel kind of like, hey, I don't actually dislike Venti. Maybe me thinking I disliked Venti was just because everyone was saying that I should like him, but actually reading the story quest, it made me feel like, hey, I actually do kind of like him. That is, in my opinion, Genshin's biggest story flaw. It's inconsistent, and they don't really know how to balance out what kind of theme to carry in their story quests and their Archon quests, which I think that we've seen, like, good balances before. I mentioned Ito's quest, but there are other quests besides Ito and Zhongli that are actually, in my opinion, really, really good. I think the Chasm storyline with Yelan, Yanfei, Ito, Kuki, and Zhao is very, very good. I think it's generally like a pretty damn good storyline. I really enjoyed it. During that time, I wasn't playing Genshin a lot, but when I started playing again, this was the story I came back to, and I enjoyed it. It lived up to the expectations. Like I said, if you like these stories, though, it's totally fine. For me, they just don't really live up to the standards that a lot of other gacha games kind of set. Genshin is one of my most played gacha games. It really only competes with Fate, Grand Order, and I think that's for a good reason. The gameplay is really good, and I think a lot of the characters are genuinely lovable. I think a lot of the characters, there's a lot of reason to like each and every one of them. There's a reason to want to play as them, and there's a reason to want to be invested in them. On the other hand, it seems like the game has so much inconsistency, and it feels like it's still early in its life. I really hope the game is going to continue improving because, like I said, the lore is really interesting, and I think the story has shown glimpses of excellence. I think at this point it's the time of the video where I'm going to try to condense my thoughts into a singular line or slogan. I think my little tagline for Genshin is, it is the goodie bag of gacha games. You'll probably get both delicious Twix bars, but there's also a high likelihood you're going to get some black licorice Twizzlers. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a comment if you disagree or agree with anything that I said. And subscribe if you like the video.